Environmental Sociology, sorry, with Dr. Mark Stoddart. So while we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. And we invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside, and you can check out nativeland.ca if you haven't already. All right, so for today in the format, we invite you to participate through the Q&A, especially. It allows people to upvote so we can prioritize different questions. We'll also have a live transcript, and Zoom can also generate translated captions into French if you would like to have that. All right, and so today, as you know, Mark Stoddart will be talking about publishing in the journal Environmental Sociology. So Mark has worked as an associate editor at Environmental Sociology since 2020, and he is a professor of sociology at Memorial University in Canada. He's a member of the Royal Society of Canada College of New Scholars, as well as the current president of the CSA. He works in the fields of environmental sociology, of course, but also political sociology and social movements, and communications and culture. His research focuses on climate change, resource extraction, energy transitions, and sustainable tourism development. He has over 90 peer-reviewed publications, and he's one of the most influential Canadian environmental sociologists. He has a new edited book that is open access called Contested Consultations in the Extractive Industries, and I'm sure if you'd like to check it out, he'll send you the link to that. And yeah, we're really happy to have him here. He's been so involved with the journal and with the ISA as well, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and thanks everyone for joining today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Tyler, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for taking the time to join today. I'll just start the screen sharing here. And there we go. Great. All right. So I'm going to do, I guess, three things today to start with. I'm going to provide a short overview of the journal Environmental Sociology, which, if you don't already know, is the official affiliate journal of the International Sociological Association's Research Committee 24, which is the Environment and Society Research Committee, and is published by Taylor and Francis. It's kind of very much become a leading international outlet for publishing a wide range of work, of international work in environmental sociology. Bit of an overview of the journal, then I'll give a bit of what I see as some of the main recurring themes or lessons that I've seen from the associate editor's desk in the last 6 years of handling manuscripts, handling reviews, processing decisions, and all that. So that'll be a bit of a checklist of what you might want to be thinking about as you're preparing a manuscript for submission to environmental sociology. And then I'm hoping we'll be able to end with ample time for question and answer. And now, Sherry, I'll ask you to just pause the recording for now. So if you have questions about any of the journal overview, just put them into the chat in the Q&A, and we'll talk about that shortly. But now I'm going to turn to a few of the things that, for me, are really recurring themes in the reviews. And I'm going to break these down into about 4 chunks based on different parts of the articles. And these are the things that I see come back from reviewers probably the most commonly. So if you were to generate a bit of a pre-submission checklist for is my article ready to go, at least these are the things I tend to see most commonly come back from reviewers. And when you think about your introduction and conclusion first, which are kind of the bread of the sandwich or the two bookends, that you really need to both be working in tandem to help the article hang together. I think one thing that reviewers are always going to look for are the research questions clearly articulated in the introduction? And are they answered by your data analysis by the end of the article? And it's kind of surprising sometimes that I think when we write, that we sometimes forget to do the very clear, like, here are my hypotheses or my research questions in a very clear way for a reader who's just seeing the manuscript for the first time. Related to that, probably more a conclusion point, is are you speaking about the theoretical generalizability of your analysis, the broader relevance of the analysis beyond the specifics of your case study? So that is really important. If there's one thing I can really drive home today, is remember your audience. If you're submitting to environmental sociology, this is an international journal. Yes, the readership is generally going to be sociologists and environmental sociologists. We also reach a lot of other environmental social scientists beyond sociology, but this is an international journal. So, as you saw, some of our top cited and top downloaded articles were about China, were about Vietnam, were about Canada. But part of what those articles will, do that makes them interesting to a broader readership is to tease out the theoretical generalizability beyond the case study or the specific kind of results and analysis. So that's really important to be able to do when pitching your work for this kind of international outlet. Second, when we turn to kind of the literature review or theoretical framework sections of papers, the things that we most commonly, or I most commonly see come back from reviewers is, are you really clearly connecting to theoretical perspectives, key concepts, or prior research in the field of environmental sociology? Um, it doesn't mean that every article has to pay homage to treadmill of production or ecological modernization theory, but it should be connecting to a recognizable literature or key concepts in the discipline. And I would point out that sending in a piece that isn't well aligned with those theoretical frameworks, key concepts, etc., that doesn't seem to engage much with environmental sociology's and epistemic community is actually one of the most common reasons that articles get desk rejected before they actually go out to review. And even if they are seen as being good enough to go out for review, reviewers almost always pick up on this. That they would like to see deeper engagement with the environmental sociology literature if it's not really there. And they might ask, like, well, why isn't this being pitched to a journal that, seems like a better fit for the bibliography, for the theoretical frameworks you're actually using, stuff like that. The other thing is, relatedly, or maybe not relatedly, is are you slowing down and unpacking the key concepts and theoretical perspectives enough for unfamiliar readers? So if you've done a comprehensive exam in environmental sociology or a course, you're probably familiar with ecological modernization theory, treadmill of production theory, for example, probably the most well-established theoretical perspectives in our discipline. But somebody coming from a different context might not be familiar with those. Somebody who's a geographer picking up an environmental sociology for the first article for the first time may be unfamiliar. So even with things that you can probably assume that a lot of the readership would know, do take your time to unpack them. Those concepts, those theories for unfamiliar readers. That's another thing that reviewers tend to often raise particular red flags with. Third, in the methodology sections, it's kind of the typical stuff that you'll get from most journals, probably from your supervisors if you're grad students, because methodology is almost always the easiest thing to poke holes in an article or in a thesis or a dissertation. And so what you need to really make sure you're doing with your methodology section is asking yourself, am I giving sufficient detail? Am I being transparent enough about my research design choices, my sampling, my data collection, the data analysis, all that stuff? Sociologists love methodological detail, and like I say, it's like kind of the easiest thing to pick on for reviewers often. So being very transparent, giving thick description of your methodology is usually a really good thing that'll help smooth the review process, right? Also showing that you're sufficiently reflexive about the qualifications and limitations of your research design choices and methodology. If your response rate's maybe not as good as it could have been, are you reflecting on why that was or how you're dealing with some gaps, things like that. Again, also remember this is an international journal, so if you are publishing on a particular case study, also make sure you're giving enough detail for unfamiliar readers so that if you're publishing a study on the creation of the Urban National Park in Toronto. I think recalling a presentation maybe Tyler gave one time or something adjacent to that in a conference. If somebody picks up the article and is really interested in it from Indonesia or Japan or Vietnam, because maybe they're working on urban national parks in those places, are you giving enough detail that they'll understand the background context, right? That doesn't mean you need to write, pages and pages and pages about everything that's ever happened in Toronto and Parks Canada, but you should help orient people who just don't know the case, right? Make sure you're doing that. Now that's another place where you can kind of really lose reviewers because reviewers are also coming from this international community, and also a place where you can lose readers from that kind of international community. Right. Lastly, I'm just going to tease out a couple things from the results and conclusion sections that I most often tend to see. And I think, we publish stuff that's both quantitative and qualitative. There's probably a bit of an overrepresentation of qualitative work in the journal overall, but certainly we publish both. There's no biases methodologically that I've ever seen in our reviewing or editorial work. So whether you're a quant or qualitative person, you should feel like it's a very welcoming home for your work. But whether it's qualitative or quantitative, are the results being presented in a clear and comprehensible way? That's a really important thing, again, to make it interpretable to readers, to reviewers, and so on. And then lastly, are the interpretations and main conclusions that you're drawing, the main arguments that you're making, are they well grounded and well aligned with the data you've presented? And that I'm going to acknowledge is a very tricky dance sometimes. That you basically want to go beyond your case. You want to show how it's theoretically generalizable. You want to, kind of show broader significance of your results. But at the same time, reviewers will be very wary of what seems like overstatement, like over making too broad claims or overstating your findings. So that can be a really tricky, delicate dance. Sometimes it kind of comes with the back and forth with reviewers, with the editor, to find that kind of sweet spot where you're saying, hey, here's how my case study about Canada is totally relevant to readers in East Asia, the United States, Australia, etc., India, without maybe coming across as though you're kind of overstating your claims or your arguments, right? So in my mind, this is about good alignment between the kind of data-based results that you present and your concluding interpretations of what they mean, what those results mean for the rest of us that are reading and reviewing these pieces and stuff like that. All right, so that I think pretty much covers the overview of the journal. So hopefully gives you a bit more familiarity with kind of what the journal looks like, how it works. Also, a bit of an overview of kind of the checklist of maybe 10 or 12 things that I've seen the most frequently come back from reviewers in the last over the last 6 years of handling manuscripts. Now I think we have lots of time for question and answer, so we can move forward to that, and maybe we'll ask Tyler to come back in and help moderate those questions. And in that, I will also stop sharing so we can feel like we're in a little more of a discussion.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Mark, for the presentation. So we currently have two questions in the Q&A. So as you start hearing these questions and the answers, feel free to add some more. I think maybe there's a couple in the chat too. Let me see. Oh no. Okay. So yeah, just use the Q&A function if you want to ask a question. So the first one here is that from Sarah, she asks, for qualitative content analysis, including of social media, what do reviewers want to see in terms of rigor?
That's a good question. So I think it's kind of the usual stuff of like just being very detailed about what you did and why you did it. I think, if you're doing more qualitative analysis, the big risk is that you draw somebody who's a bit more of a quantitative person who tends to work with like big data, like social media based big data. So they're going to be very concerned with kind of representativeness of sampling. I would say that that piece with Yasmin Coop Monteiro, I'm the second or third author on that. So we went through that from the reviewer side of the desk. And that was very much a qualitative analysis of Instagram content, where we were basically scraping content manually at the kind of the same time period every day for about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, I think about 3 weeks over the COP meetings, right? The Glasgow COP meetings in that case. So the question that reviewers bring up is like really about representativeness. If you're going in, you're kind of manually scraping rather than using kind of automated data retrieval. If you're doing it qualitatively, where there's a lot of visual analysis, in our case, you're also working with a relatively smaller data set. I think we still worked with like something like 2,000 Instagram posts, but if compared to stuff people who actually do the big data quant stuff, that's actually small. So I think being able to justify just like, okay, if I'm working with, 100 or a couple hundred posts from a platform, why does that make sense? Why is that justifiable? And of course, with qualitative work, usually the trade-off is depth. You can do a lot more with depth than you can do, say, with the big corpus analysis where you're just doing like word correspondence kind of stuff, right? Like word co-occurrences. Really interesting in its own right, but it's working at a much higher level of abstraction. So I think getting used to articulating, like maybe, yes, I'm working with a smaller sample. Yes, I'm working with a more non-representative sample, but here's why I'm making those choices, and here's why it has value in and of itself, right? The ability to go into more depth, the ability to do more visual analysis, for example, things like that. So I think there's ways you can kind of frame it, and if you can do that in your methodology section before you submit, that kind of saves you having to have those arguments with reviewers after the fact. And I think, having published on the Instagram stuff enough over the last few years, we've now kind of gotten better at anticipating those criticisms, those reviewer comments, and building that into our methods sections before we put it in. That said, you'll still get reviewers who are more quantitatively oriented. They will still ask for further justification, things like that. But that's how I would tend to approach it, from my experience on both sides of the desk as an author and as an editor. Uh,
Hmm. So there's no absolute sample size, but you need to have a response to the sample size question.
exactly. Why the sample size makes sense for what you want to do with it. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. Yeah,
All right, and another question. I can also read these out anonymously since it's being recorded, so I just won't say people's
sure.
names. But the question is, how do you justify, well, I guess this is a further question on the same topic. How do you justify sampling decisions for platform-based research such as Instagram and TikTok?
So I think the most common approaches that have been used in like the literatures are kind of either hashtag based approaches where you're looking at a particular, I think especially for like social movement kind of work, where the hashtag becomes kind of like the focal point for sampling around a particular campaign, and all that kind of stuff. And so that's pretty well established. I think that's pretty common. The other, of course, the big one would be like user account based. So in my mind, that's kind of that's the major decision. Are you taking a user account based approach or a hashtag based approach? And just like, okay, like if we're looking for like what you're actually interested in is a particular campaign or a mobilization around a particular event, then the hashtag based approach probably makes a lot of sense. If you're more interested in just like the key actors in a field or in a policy dispute or something like that, or if we're thinking about TikTok, maybe we're like kind of specific influencers who
Mhm.
post a lot in an area, like say like kind of pro-vegan activism or something like that, or conscious consumerism, things of that nature, degrowth, where it's a broader thing that's maybe not, as obviously hanging together through a single hashtag. Then what you might want to do is like the background work of trying a whole bunch of different hashtags, and then you see, okay, who are the most important user accounts that keep showing up? Set some thresholds and decide, okay, what's a good threshold? Piece of like how many followers people have, how much they're posting about a thing, and then you can kind of download the whole thread of those user accounts and use that as your database versus the posts that are organized around a particular hashtag, right? Work I've done with Instagram mostly been hashtag based because it's oriented around those COP events. But if I was
Mm,
maybe looking at climate communication more broadly, might want to take more of a user-based approach, for example, where you're kind of trying to identify, kind of a certain threshold of users, or maybe a certain like build in some diversity of users, perspectives and standpoints, regions that people are based in, all those kind of purposive sampling things we might want to think about, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's in the end of the day, it's like just keeping track of your thinking about like if you set thresholds on how many posts to include because of bandwidth, because of time, where are you setting the threshold and why? For the Instagram stuff, we've usually been dealing with pretty large data sets, for example. So a couple thousand, but then what we've done usually is set a threshold of at least one like or retweet as a bare
mm,
minimum minimal threshold to show some form of engagement, right? So that kind of also becomes a way you can kind of, say, hey, this is a consistent inclusion or exclusion rule I used in my sample construction, right? So keeping track of those decisions where you've said, okay, this is what I'm going to include, this is what I'm going to exclude, and why, because that's usually what reviewers will want to know. Um, occasionally you will get a jerky reviewer who's like, this is a terrible study because it's not the study I would have done if I was doing it on this topic. But I would generally see that as, the classic, I don't like this piece because it's not the way I would have done the project. It's like not really good reviewing, right? Like reviewers are
mm,
ultimately there to try to make the piece the best it can be. And sometimes pieces don't meet the threshold for the journal. Sometimes pieces do get rejected. But, I think most, 9 times out of 10 reviewers are there to try to be constructively critical, even when sometimes their tone doesn't always reflect that, but to try to make the work better and better. So I think it's that, just being able to articulate these are the decisions I made around thresholds, around a hashtag based approach or a user based approach, and this is why it made sense for this project. Yeah.
mhm,
And then when you come to your, qualifications and limitations, maybe that's where you say, of course we could scale this up. It would be awesome if we could scale this up. We might see different things if we took a more, big data corpus kind of approach. But, maybe what you lose is the more the depth and nuance that you can get from more qualitative forms of analysis. Right.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just a short follow-up on that. From your experience in the journal, um, how much like authority for accepting the article is delegated to the reviewers versus the editor? And yeah, how do you think that might change or stay the same going forward with the new editor?
So it's a mix, right? The first decision point is actually with the editor in chief. So right now the article lands on Stuart Lockey. Every article, every single piece lands on Stuart Lockey's desk first.
Mm,
Um, he gives a desk review first, and really all he's looking for is does this kind of meet our minimum quality thresholds in terms of data writing quality, stuff like that? And then does it fit the scope of the journal? So, like I said, like most of the desk rejects are actually because people submit stuff that isn't really, it's not referencing anything in environmental sociology. It doesn't really seem to fit the scope of the journal. That's
mm,
actually the most common reason it gets booted out at that point. Stuart will either then handle the reviewer assignments himself, or he'll move it over to myself or Catherine Wong. Usually that's based on our relative expertise, also our regional awareness and stuff like that. So,
mm,
that Stuart tends to handle a lot more of the Asia Pacific stuff, Catherine European and Asian, probably me North American and European. So we kind of have a bit of coverage that way. And I said that, and that's pretty broad strokes, pretty general, but sometimes, I've done way more, for example, on media and climate change than the other two. So if a paper rolls in that's about media and climate change in Ghana or Nigeria or, Australia even, it's probably likely to like, where Stuart works, still probably more likely to land on my desk. So I send stuff, would send stuff out to reviewers. My process for choosing reviewers, and I think is pretty similar with a lot of editors, is to start with your bibliography and see who you're citing there, right? That's a familiar face or name. I usually try to look and say, okay, who are you citing that's also published in environmental sociology, so that actually knows the journal?
mhm,
Or if not, if I have to go deeper down, who are you citing in journals that I would see as kind of commensurate with environmental sociology? Who are you citing from SNR, Ecology and Society, Environmental Politics, the kind of our kind of sister journals or sibling
Hmm.
journals. And those become my kind of long list of people. So my, would be to build a reviewer pool, usually try to have 6 or 10 names. Post-COVID, it's gotten a lot harder to get people to say yes to reviewing. I'm currently handling a manuscript where I'm on my 18th reviewer request, which I think is my personal record. But it's not unusual to have to go through 6 or 10 reviewer requests before you secure the 2 reviews that we're looking for. Now, to get to a very long road to an answer to Tyler's question, or to the question, but then once I receive the reviews, of course, the easiest ones to process are if both people, have very similar opinions. The first decision point is almost always major revisions, because it's very rare that reviewers won't see something they want to see addressed and reviewed. So if you get a major revisions decision, you've definitely won. You've moved forward in the process. That means that the editor wants to see the article again, right? Like, don't be dispirited when you see the phrase major revisions. The train is pulling forward. You're still on it. We want to see the revisions. We want the article back. If that wasn't the case, it would be a reject decision, right? Which is not that common, not super rare, but not that common. I'd probably say I've handled maybe like 10 or 15% of the articles I've handled have had a reject during the process. Most of them, it's a major revisions decision. Some of them go through 2 or 3 rounds of major and then minor decisions. But I would say the average article is probably accepted on its second or third submission. That's pretty much the standard. Third submission is not uncommon, and sometimes you go from major revisions to minor revisions to an acceptance.
Hmm.
Where things get tricky is if the 2 reviewers are not aligned, if they recommend different things, right? So if one recommends a reject, the other recommends major revisions, then you really, as the editor, have the discretion to like look at their comments and really kind of assess for yourself, okay, based on their comments, does this feel more like a reject or a major revisions? Or when you get to the second or third round of review, if one's an accept, the other's a minor revisions. Is that an article that needs to go back to the reviewer for a check, or is that something where the minor revisions are so minor that I can call it a conditional accept and just do editorial review when it comes back in, right? Just so at some point we'll say like, oh, if things are super minor, I'm not going to go bother Tyler, for example, to re-review this article for the third time if what he said last time was like really edits to like 3 or 4 sentences. At that point, I can read it and trust my own judgment, right?
Hmm.
So I think that's where you get tricky though, is those discrepancies across reviewers. If the reviewers are unanimous, I pretty much will always side with them. I'm not going to, yeah, I think if 2 reviewers recommended a reject, I'm probably not going to argue with that. If 2 reviewers come to an accept on a piece, I'm also not going to argue with that because otherwise we never should have sent it out for review to begin with, right? It should have been, if we felt like it didn't fit in the journal, it should have been desk rejected and saved everybody a lot of time and energy and effort, basically. But that's a bit of, how the actual process works from the editor desk. And I say, so if you're being strategic about it, like just, you might want to like think about, okay, citing stuff in your bibliography where you have an arm's length relationship, so not your supervisor or something, but where you want the editors to maybe think about, okay, who would be good to review this piece? Because that's really the first place we're going to look for the most part. And especially if you're citing things from the journal, that's really where I'm going to make my first call, cast the fishing net or fishing line out first to try to get reviewers is when you cite people who've previously published in the journal that are doing related work to you. So you can strategically use your bibliography a bit like that to help just kind of guide the reviewer or the editor rather to the kinds of reviewers you think would be a good and good meaning constructively critical, but supportive, broadly supportive of the work you do. Right. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's all really great advice and good insight into the process. All right, so we have another question on the topic of data. Uh, so for interview-based research, does the journal have a specific expectation or threshold for the number of interviews?
No, that'll also really depend a lot, because the nature of your population can be extremely different based on what kind of what kind of topic you're doing. So if you're doing stuff where you're really trying to do like key stakeholder interviews, for example, or kind of elite interviews from like government or like corporations, your whole population might only be 10 or 15 people that you're even interested in interviewing, in which case if you get five or six, that could be awesome, right? Like that's, but again, I think it's justifying why the sample size makes sense for the project that you're doing. And
Mm,
I'm gonna think it's not I don't think it's an article we published, but Deborah Davidson did some really great work, in her work on sociology of emotions and climate change. I think one of the better publications on that, from the early days of her work on that, only had a few interviews. I think like four or five interviews,
mm,
but worked in kind of did enough theoretical development, that I think it's become a quite well cited piece, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's again, it's you know, if you're so I think on one hand, if you have four or five interviews, but it makes sense theoretically or in terms of a purpose of sample, that in terms of the population, that's fine. I think it's so I think be a bit narcissistic and call back to my postdoc research. I was doing stuff on kind of recreational land use conflicts in British Columbia and
mm,
Nova Scotia. The entire roster of groups I wanted to speak to was about 15 environmental groups, split between Nova Scotia and BC. I got seven interviews, which was great.
mm,
And so he's like, when you send it out to review, people are like, oh, that's a very small number. It's like, yeah, but it's like 50% of the organizations I was hoping to talk to, who are really engaged in this issue, right? So where I think where you would run into trouble is saying, if you say I'm studying the general public of Ontario's views of onshore wind farms, right, for example, and local opposition to wind farms. I know we've published on this area in Alberta, a piece by Max Chewinski, really great piece. But if you're like,
mm,
I'm just talking to I'm trying to generalize about the general public, but I've only done four or five interviews, there you get into trickier waters, right? So it's like, does a small number sample size make sense to the social groups that you're trying to generalize about or make claims about, right?
mm,
Or draw inferences about, in terms of theoretical generalizability and stuff like that, right? And so you might have to frame it a bit differently and stuff like that. So I'd say no hard
mm,
and fast numbers. I think it's more being able to explain to a reviewer, why you did what you did and why it makes sense for
mm.
the analysis. That's really always going to be the key. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that you've mentioned a few times, is that if you have a good reason for doing what you're doing, that's like internal to the paper, not like, oh, my
Mhm.
funding ran out or something, but
Yeah.
something that's about like, intrinsic to the paper itself, then
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what the reviewers will be pushing you on. And if you happen to have a rationalization for that, then or a rationale for that, then you'll be ready for the review process.
Exactly. And I would also say like in your methodological reflexivity piece really comes into play there of just being self-aware of maybe where some of the gaps or shortfalls are that would be great to address through further research or other projects.
Hmm.
And just again some like self-awareness and reflexivity about those qualifications and limitations also goes a long way with reviewers, right? So to not to not overstate the case, right? Reviewers will catch that usually. Yeah.
Hmm. And I know a few years ago there was a case at a major sociology journal where they were trying to study a general population and they had 25 qualitative interviews and it was rejected on the basis of the interviews.
Mhm.
So if there is a general population like that, is there kind of like a 30 interview thing, or it's still just like very, what is the case? Like, can you justify? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's again the justification. Like, I think if you're trying to do general public, um, you know, you're always going to get, especially if you draw a quantitative reviewer, you're always going to get the question of, well, why wasn't that a survey? And you better have a damn good answer to why it wasn't a survey if you're trying to talk about the general public in an area. Uh, but no, I would say though, like, like there was kind of that standard, like a lot of qualitative monographs and dissertations are based on that 25 to 30 or kind of a 25 to 35 interviews. There's also a lot of literature on sampling that says you want, kind of a minimum of 10 to 12 interviews for any distinct subgroup in your sample,
Mhm.
kind of for a kind of relatively homogeneous subgroup. So there's all sorts of different, guidelines and stuff. But I think it is very project dependent. It's about which who you're studying. I'd say also like how creative you can be around filling in the missing data. So if you know that there's gaps in who you're reaching, are there other ways you can draw on gray literature, policy documents, corporate reports, media articles,
Mm,
social media content, whatever it is, to kind of substitute in for some of those missing participants, or to help kind of strengthen the evidence if you're working with a small sample, and it's a small sample, right? So if it is like a general public thing, maybe the interviews become one piece of your data, but you can kind of complement it with thinking about, oh, okay, like where else are the general public engaging in the discussions that you're interested in or the issue that you're interested in, and maybe start, kind of just broadening out. I'm not a big fan of the term triangulation. I kind of like Laurel Richards's idea of crystallization a bit better. But where can you build some more facets to the crystal? Maybe
mm,
if you are kind of, thinking, oh, maybe my sample's a bit too small to kind of get past a reviewer, especially if I happen to draw like a more critical quant reviewer, which is always the risk with qualitative papers. But I think one of the good things about the journal right now is like Stuart, Catherine, and I are all predominantly qualitative people, but who also work with mixed methods and quantitative people. So if anything, I think we do have a pretty friendly environment for qualitative work, for sure. Yeah.
hmm And yeah, when I was in graduate school, it was only in the last few years that I started to be aware of this concept of triangulation. So for people who are
Yeah.
new to that, could you say more about it?
Oh, just
Or
using multiple data
crystallization,
sources to kind of help answer, yeah, like the use of multiple data sources to answer the same kind of research questions. I kind of like crystallization better. I think it's kind of a
right?
nicer
Yeah.
metaphor, a little less kind of linear. Like there's 3 points, and if you put them together, you arrive at the truth with a capital T. Crystallization, you hold it up to the light at different angles, it refracts light differently. More,
Mm,
the idea that there's kind of different lenses on the world. I'm a big fan of John Law's method book, After Method,
mm,
where basically argues, that the social world is far too complex and messy for just a singular method or something as simplistic as triangulation. So crystallization is it's kind of a, yeah, like, and I've had to do this multiple times with my own projects because I often do try to interview folks in government and oil companies. Elites are really hard to recruit from, elite organizations. So often I'm trying to cast around for, okay, how can I fill those gaps, right? Is it going, so often it's going to the corporate or government websites, getting their annual reports, getting, impact assessment documentation, whatever it is, to kind of fill out the missing data from the interviews I'm not getting. Right. So, yeah.
great. Thank you so much for that. I don't know about that book, and I'm going to be checking it out.
Oh,
Um, all right. So there are no more questions in the
oh, I
Q&A
see one in the chat
or
has just
in the
popped
chat.
up.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
great. Okay. Did you want to read it or I could read it out?
If you want to read it out, that'd be great. Yeah. Makes it
Sure.
feel more conversational that way, at least a little bit. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think I had another question that was a direct message. Okay, great. So, so most qualitative research involves a lot of descriptions at the results section, and therefore the paper can get a bit long, like 8,000 to 10,000 words. And how flexible are the editors of environmental sociology about the word length, given that feature of qualitative work? And there's a follow-up question. Maybe I'll ask it after you answer the first part.
Sure. Off the top of my head, I think our word limit at Environmental Social is 8,000 words. So I would say on first submission, that's fairly firm. That basically, if a manuscript comes in that's much longer than that, you really risk Stuart turning it back and sending it back to you and say, hey, you need to edit this down more to get it into word count. If it's
Mm,
100 or 200 word, a few hundred words over, probably not a big deal. But yeah, like I'd say really do your best to stick to the word count on your first submission. There's a great line that's been attributed to Mark Twain, where he says, sorry for the length of my letter. If I had more time, I would have made it shorter.
hmm
Your first response to a long manuscript should always be more editing rather than just sending it out and hoping that the editor and reviewers are going to just be nice and let it slide. However, I would say on the revisions, when it is pretty common when you're revising a manuscript that it'll grow by 1,000 or more words. It's pretty standard. And I think there generally is more flexibility around revisions, revised manuscripts. The
Mhm.
magic phrase I always put in my cover letters in those cases is in order to adequately address the reviewer's comments, the manuscript is now 9,000 whatever words, and then just leave it up to the editor to decide whether they come back to you or not. Some journals are really hardcore about that. They will say, the editor will come back and say, that's awesome, you did all these revisions, now make it 8,000 words again, just a real
Mhm.
pain in the ass. We tend to be a bit more flexible. So I think Stuart is kind of the one who makes the ultimate final decision as the editor in chief. He's usually flexible about giving people, 9 to 10,000 words if they need it, on the basis of the review process.
Mhm.
Over 10,000 words, it's probably going to bounce back to you and say, no, you just need to edit this more, maybe even over 9,000. But there is some flexibility. But I would say, like, if you can do your best to treat the journal's word limit as an absolute maximum, uh Gandalf on the bridge saying thou shalt not pass if you're like over, uh Lord of the Rings reference. We're just watching Lord of the Rings over Christmas with my daughter. That's really good. And then allow the flexibility on the revisions. Do what you need to do to meet the reviewer's needs, and then let the editor decide at that point whether they want you to go back for another round of just kind of editing and tightening things up. That would be my general strategy, and I think it's usually works, and I think that's how we tend to do it at Environmental Soc. Is that 8,000 limit gets a little bit
Mhm.
fuzzier and more negotiable based on the review process and the revision process.
Great. Yeah, makes sense. And then the follow-up question they had was, what advice would you give to those using qualitative data on how to be strategic, not to exceed the word count, and still be able to develop its theoretical and empirical contribution adequately and fully explain all of the components of the research?
Yeah, so I think one thing, there's often a tendency, because we have this beautiful, rich qualitative interview data, especially, or maybe field note data, to often kind of include quotes that are just too long, that have too much context or before. So
Mm,
really just trying to tighten up the excerpts that you're using, even though it can kind of feel painful to remove all this interesting data. I think that's one approach, is just like for every point you're trying to make, have two or three quotes and really try to tighten them up as much as you can. If reviewers want to see more kind of evidence or proof, you can always maybe submit like an appendix or supplementary material that gives more quotes. And I've even seen people do this in kind of table form, where you kind of would break it down into almost your sections and like the findings,
mm,
and then have some additional, kind of quotes or evidence. But I think that's kind of really the trick, is like, tighten up the quotes you are using, tighten the number that you're using, becomes the way to kind of try to keep the qualitative flavor, uh, without sacrificing too much of the depth, hopefully. I think it's maybe one of the reasons you could argue that often book monographs are better for long form qualitative research in some ways. And of course, the other solution is it might be that the article itself needs to be framed tighter around the research questions that you're asking. Maybe you're asking too many research questions in the piece, and what you actually have is two different articles, right? If you're
mm,
finding that you're having those issues. And that could be another issue where it's like, oh, maybe like I want to keep the qualitative richness, but maybe what I have here are two main arguments, two separate contributions that revolve around different questions, things like that. So I think there's a bit of, so like just, yeah, like kind of the first response should be revision and editing, and then kind of taking it from there. But I think, like fewer quotes, more tight, and then appendix material if the reviewers want to see more of that detail after the fact. And if you want the bigger canvas where you can really say, like, have the full richness of the field note data or the interview data, then it's like maybe at the end of the day, a book monograph is where that
mhm,
project needs to ultimately go at some point, right? With an article or two on the way to get there, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. Uh, all right. So another question is, I guess we have 5 minutes, so but
Yeah.
when you get conflicting reviewer comments,
Mhm.
how should you respond strategically, like as the
Oh,
author?
yeah. So one thing, so normally the editor should try to help give a bit of guidance and steering. However, with Manuscript Central, I still haven't been able to figure out how to go like I write up comments, and then when I go to process the decision, they like vanish from
Mhm.
the decision letter. So I have to
Mhm.
troubleshoot that myself right now, because right now what people are getting with our new system is just kind of more of a form letter from me, rather
Mhm.
than here is how it would be great if you could address the comments. So I think the thing is, if you do have conflicting comments around the similar issue, I think it's like just picking which one makes the most sense to you, and then in the response to reviewers, kind of saying, you know, that you just point out like these were conflicting recommendations. We
Mhm.
gave it careful consideration. We chose to respond to reviewer one rather than reviewer two, or take it in the direction of reviewer one rather than reviewer two, and this is why. And I think that's the really important thing when
Mhm.
things go back out for review is the and this is why if you don't respond to a comment or if you don't implement a revision, it's like what's the rationale for it. Is that it yeah, so I think that's just you sometimes have to do that, pick a side, but then in the response letter acknowledge the conflict and why you picked that side.
Mhm.
Yeah. And because of
Yeah.
course the editor is also reading all the reviews, so the editors or associate editors are also very aware that you're getting
Mhm.
conflicting advice. Like we're not there to make you kind of do the impossible task of trying to appease all the things if they're in conflict with each other.
Mhm. All right. I think one last question here. I think it's a quick one. Is uh, around how long is it from submission to the response if it's not a desk reject?
Yeah, so if it goes out to review, it can vary a lot, actually. And that goes back to what I was saying about how it's getting really hard to get people post-COVID. Like, I think there is this what is it called? The Guardian, I think, referred to it as the Great Exhaustion, the Guardian newspaper. But I think it's gotten extremely difficult to find reviewers and assessors for all sorts of things. Everything from thesis examiners to journal reviewers, like anything with assessment that's kind of, semi-voluntary, has gotten harder. So, um, if reviewers say yes right away, so if a thing hits my desk, I'm usually going to build up that reviewer pool and send it out in a week or less is kind of how I tend to work. Um, if the first two reviewers I ask hopefully say yes, fingers crossed, knock on wood, all the things, and they usually have, I think it's a 1 month review period that we have. If they deliver on time, which is another big if, then it's probably going to be in review grand total 2 months or less, right? Between the desk review stage and me trying to organize reviewers and getting stuff back. Um, However, I'd say these days, it's almost like a unicorn event that your first two reviewers say yes and that they both turn things in on time. So often people will just drop out after agreeing to review and will just disappear and never submit the review. So then you're back to the drawing board trying to secure a new reviewer. And often also people will wait to respond about whether they'll do a review or not. So our standard practice at the journal is we invite a reviewer and then we give them 2 weeks to respond before we seek a new reviewer, right? If you're going down the list of 10 or 12 reviewers, that multiplies really quickly, right? To get people. And you're working with two at a time, right? You're trying to secure two reviewers. If somebody drops the ball and never submits their review after multiple reminders, we usually give people 3 weeks after review is due if we haven't heard from them with like an extension request or something before we then seek a new reviewer. So it's kind of shocking how much legwork that we have to do as editors, I think sometimes. So you can just burn like often months just trying to actually secure the two reviews you need to move it forward. And then, of course, if people are late and all that stuff. So I think in an ideal world, a month or two, but that's really the minority of papers these days. I would say that the probably the norm now right now is probably like 4 to 6 months. But that's not because the editors are lazy. It's because we're kind of like constantly going out looking for reviewers. We have to wait if people say no or not. So one thing I've learned actually is the editor in the editor's chair, when you get reviewer requests, the quicker you can respond, whether it's a yes or a no, the more you're helping out your colleagues who are submitting work, the more you're helping out the editor. Because even if you know you can't do it, if you respond right away, then I'm on the desk trying to get a new reviewer within the next day or two, right? If you just let it linger and don't respond, that's 2 weeks added to the review process before I go seek out a new reviewer, right? So even if you can't respond, just let us know. Like that's actually a huge help, not just to the editor, but to everybody who's submitting work as well,
Mhm.
as a collective community, right? And likewise, if you agree to review, try to get it in, try not to be too late. Don't just disappear and ghost the paper, because then that's again like that means that's cost people like basically a couple of months, right?
Hmm.
Before you secure a new reviewer. And also, I would say, like, if you agree to review, it's really great when you can agree to review the revisions because that's also can get tricky on a major revision, especially where we still want to have it reviewed by two reviewers. If we go out and have to go out and seek new reviewers, that can sometimes bring up whole new issues, almost like starting the process over again. So when you're getting to the point of like getting reviewer requests, it's really good if you can assume if you say yes to the initial revision that you should stay on board, until the article is either accepted or rejected. Like you're kind of there for the long haul. And I think it's just a much more collegial way and just helps everybody out. But yeah, so I'd say like, it's a tough question to answer because of just those difficulties. But in an ideal world, 2 months or less. In the real world, 4 to 6 months for the average article right now. But I
Hmm.
don't think that's that different than most other journals I've had experience with in the last few years. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a paper out of journal right now, and I'm on my sixth reviewer because the first three left after the
Yeah, and
first
that's brutal.
round.
That can
So
that can be brutal. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, so I guess that's the time, right?
Yeah.
So
That is.
yeah, thanks so much, Mark, for doing this, and thank you all for such great questions. This was really interesting and helpful. I love the thing you said about how a major revision is actually a good thing. So if you get that, don't be like, oh no, I'm bad. Like that's actually like, hey, you're
Yeah.
doing well. So
Anything that's not an outright reject means the editors want to see the piece again. That's a good thing.
mhm.
That means you have forward momentum and the piece is moving forward. So thanks everybody, thanks very much everyone for attending today as well and sharing the time and your thoughts and questions. And yeah, to Tyler for organizing and Fatima.
Yeah. All right. Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.